I'm an instructor in the Department of Kinesiology, where I teach a wheelchair sports class, and I also do a lot of guest lectures on disability-related content. I have a background in rehabilitation counseling, and I also have a second master's degree in sports psychology. So a lot of what I talk about today is going to be rooted in self-determination theory, and specifically, I'm going to talk about creating inclusive, adapted physical activity environments for individuals with all disabilities, but also cerebral palsy. And I will add also that I established our MSU Adaptive Sports and Recreation Club in 2014, which now seems like ages ago. I remember doing this, I forget what year it was, but I think I did this like 5 years ago or something, and we were like kind of just getting started. So, but anyway, if we can go and go to the next slide, please. All right, so there is a range of benefits to adapted physical activity, and we talked about in a recent presentation that a lot of people with CPE report increased pain. So physical activity can definitely help reduce that, and also reduce the risk of secondary health conditions. If you think about physical disabilities in general, we are, and I say we because I have cerebral palsy myself, we are a lot more likely to lead a sedentary lifestyle due to a range of different barriers, which I will go over. And if your bones aren't bearing weight, if your muscles aren't getting used, that's obviously going to lead to secondary health conditions, as we just heard. There's also psychological benefits, so reduced stress, and I would say very importantly, improved self-confidence and increased self-efficacy in a range of different tasks. Self-efficacy is a global concept, so yes, it applies to physical activity, but also in other domains. So it's a very transferable skill to pick up. In terms of social benefits, there's obviously friendships and increased networking capacity. Also, increased access to mentors. I will be very honest with you guys and tell you that I didn't look up to a person with a disability till I was about in my early 30s, right? And that was when I met Duncan, right? He was the first person with CP that I could like relate to in a positive way. And that can be kind of difficult to grow up without mentors, and a lot of times through physical activity, you meet different peers and friends and mentors and such. So that's very important. Also, very importantly, through physical activity, you get increased opportunities to travel, which for our population of individuals with physical disabilities in particular is greatly reduced, because we don't often know what we're going to get on the other side of wherever we're going in terms of accessibility and whatnot. I will say that we recently went to Switzerland with our MSU and Team USA Wheelchair Floral Team, and we have a tournament coming up in February in Sweden. So if it wasn't for adapted physical activity, I would not have a lot of these travel opportunities. And outside of that, improved academic outcomes and thank you. And also, there's studies that suggest that there's improved employment prospects through participation in wheelchair sports, and through that, overall increased quality of life. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So that first slide was all great, right? Except that there's all these barriers to getting all these benefits that are particularly true for people with disabilities, right? So individuals with disabilities have low levels of perceived ability, particularly in the area of sports, because we don't really, particularly people with CP, we don't really get opportunities growing up to participate in much physical activity or team sports. Wheelchair sports can also be very expensive, right? So some of the chairs that we use range anywhere from $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. Right. So, and we also know that a lot of people with disabilities are both undereducated and underemployed compared to the general population, which will have an impact, a subsequent impact on their finances. As I mentioned, we lack peers and role models. Growing up, there was a lack of trained individuals who know how to work with individuals with cerebral palsy in the context of exercise and sport. Somebody like me tries something new, and I have an able-bodied individual trying to explain to me how to perform a certain sports-related task. Sometimes it's very hard for me to explain that my body just doesn't work that way. And sometimes you just have to get super creative with different tasks. So that's where working out and exercising with people like yourself is really helpful because they can guide you through some of these processes. And then lastly, we have a lot of environmental barriers that include lack of accessible facilities, transportation, things like poor scheduling. A lot of times this type of programming is scheduled at very inconvenient times of the day for individuals with disabilities because it's might not be as profitable or whatnot as something that another population that might bring in more money for a facility is. And then just an overall lack of quality, inclusive, adapted physical activity opportunities. So I'm good there. If you could move to the next slide. All right. So as I mentioned, the program I run is rooted in self-determination theory. And I will start out by saying that I believe that regardless of whether somebody has a disability or not, I believe that all human beings go through the same cognitive processes when they exercise and participate in sports, which also means that all human beings, including individuals with disabilities, have the same innate needs, and those are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So I'll just go through these real quick, but basically autonomy is your ability to choose the activity you participate in and the way you participate in it. Competence, the more you do something, in general, you're gonna get better at it. But if you don't have consistent opportunities, then that really takes that out of the equation. And then lastly, in terms of motivation, we're often driven by those close to us. So we're more likely to participate in things with people we can relate to or with our friends, right? And when we can reach all three of these needs or attain them, then we are optimally motivated and more likely to return to that particular activity. And this obviously has limitations in that, if you're a high level elite athlete, this kind of goes out the window. We're a recreational program, so it's very applicable to what we do. So that's that there. If we could move to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, when you add disability to any equation, it becomes interesting. So when you add cerebral palsy to this, for a range of reasons, oftentimes we don't have a lot of autonomy in our life, or at least compared to individuals without disabilities. So oftentimes choices are made for us. And I have a question in there, is it in our best interest? I think a lot of times it is well-intended, but if you're taking away decision-making and independence, I think it's more harmful than good oftentimes, right? So there needs to be an appropriate balance that's reached there. In terms of competence, like I said, we lack opportunities to develop competence, and oftentimes the frequency of these type of activities is not sufficient enough to allow us to get good at certain tasks. And I'll give you guys one example in terms of competition level, right? So I traveled to a few wheelchair tennis tournaments, and one of my very first wheelchair tennis tournaments was at the University of Alabama, where the only reason I got to go was because I was eligible because I was still a student on campus and I had a wheelchair and kind of knew how to play tennis. My very first competitive match was actually against a US Paralympian, which I don't need to tell you how that went, but it was 6-0, 6-0, right? It was a very quick match. But like it's just one of those things. No parent of a child with CP is going to send them or her back into that context if it's not appropriate to begin with, right? Like I mean I'm going to do that again and again till I get better, but I think I'm a little bit of an outlier in terms of that. But and I want to highlight too that oftentimes people with disabilities are overprotected in the context of sport and physical activity, so we really don't have any opportunities to learn from failure when things like injury or poor experiences are actually an inherent part of sport for able-bodied individuals. And I think the most important part of sport, and it's where they grow the most. And we're, as a disability population, we're completely excluded from that. And then lastly, in terms of relatedness, as I mentioned, we lack role models who we can relate to and get positive feedback from. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So I'll talk about our program a little bit and what we've done to kind of try to minimize some of the barriers. So it's a program that I actually started as an internship project in 2014 with the Research Center for Persons with Disabilities, because while I was doing my undergrad here, I realized there was a severe lack of opportunities for students with physical disabilities on our campus. And by a severe lack, I mean, they were essentially non-existent. So there was nothing. And then we officially started in September of 2014 with 2 practices a week. Today, we're the most consistent and comprehensive recreational leisure sports program on a college campus in the country, which is a lot of adjectives, but the more adjectives you add to something, the better you are. So here we are. No, I said it as a joke, but it's problematic because if a program like ours in a short time of even 8 years can reach this level, that also means that there's no outside opportunities available that are similar, and that's very problematic because there are people with disabilities everywhere that could benefit from this type of programming. Just to give you guys some data, in 8+ years now, we've held a total of over 1,300 practices. So now we practice 5 times a week for 2 hours. So people can come in and out regardless of their schedule and whatnot. We've offered almost 3,000 hours of programming and had a combined total attendance of almost 8,000 and supported over 17,000 hours of adapted physical activity. And we use self-determination theory as a cornerstone of our program. I think I have 1 or 2 more slides here. So with our program specifically, in terms of autonomy, we give people a choice of activity because we have lots of different options available and lots of different options in terms of time slots as well when you can attend. I didn't mention on the last slide, but we've now acquired close to $250,000 in the grants in 8 years for our program. So we've been able to get lots of different equipment to provide different type of opportunities for different levels of disability as well. In terms of competence, the frequency of what we do allows people to develop skills. And in terms of relatedness, when you come to one of our practices, you finally see somebody like yourself doing something you maybe have always wanted to do. right? Because I think sometimes what happens in other settings, like if you do like a Paralympic day in sports at a high school or middle school, and you have this like elite level athlete come in and and you're just this kid with CP who can't like dribble a ball. Like, I mean, that's all nice and great, but like it's just not going to do much for you. It's better than nothing, but it's not the most appropriate thing, I think. So if we can skip ahead, please. So here are some suggestions I have to creating inclusive environments, particularly for people with cerebral palsy. So you definitely want to maximize intrinsic motivation using those aspects of self-determination theory. But I also want to point out a distinction between, an important distinction between physical accessibility and social inclusion. There's a lot of great facilities out there who've gone through renovations and different things and are now up to ADA code, but that doesn't mean that they offer programming that is actually inclusive or truly integrates people with disabilities. And I believe the latter is far more important than the first. Although if you can't get in the building, then you can't do what's inside. But I think you guys understand what I'm saying. I also think it's important to provide the right amount of challenge in a supported environment. Because oftentimes in a lot of different domains, people with disabilities have a very low bar of expectations placed on them. And the one thing I'll tell you is like, we can always read that. We know when you are kind of selling us short or don't think we can do something. That's very, very clear and transparent to us. So it's important to find that balance where you find a task that a person can continually improve at without making it too easy, if that makes sense. It's also important to prioritize self-improvement over comparison to others, particularly when you have disabilities involved. We talked about how cerebral palsy manifests itself in so many different ways. I have many teammates with cerebral palsy, and we all do the same thing in a very different way. So to compare myself to one of them would not always be appropriate. So I always emphasize self-improvement over comparing yourself to other people. Try to group individuals with similar skill sets when possible. This is not always possible, mostly because of what I just said, that there's just a very wide range of function out there, but when you can, it's important to. I also wanted to allude to clinical versus non-clinical settings. Cerebral palsy obviously is a pediatric disability, and we spend more time than we'd like in clinical settings. Anytime you can move any of these activities or these opportunities into the community, I think it's very important. And then one thing that we found that works for us is modifying rules and even making up different games that allow everybody to participate in a meaningful way. And I have a couple examples out there. One game we play is we don't have hoops in some of the facilities that we use, so we just use trash games, and then we play a modified version of wheelchair trash ball, where we one of the rules is that you have to every pass has to be a bounce and every shot has to be a bounce. So I don't know if any of you have ever thrown a chest pass to a person with a cerebral palsy. Probably not a good idea, right? But if you throw it into the ground first, then that gives that person time to read, where the ball might go. So sometimes it's very simple modifications like that will help. And then in terms of table tennis, we have a rule where like any ball on the table is a live ball till it falls off the table, regardless of how many times it bounces. So if somebody doesn't have the range of motion to reach something right away, or if somebody can't maybe serve in a certain like prescribed way, we make some modifications in terms of that, and suddenly anybody can play, right? I think I have one last slide after this, and we're good. Oh, it's last slide. Oh, okay. Maybe I don't. Oh, huh. Okay. So what?
what was in this growth slide. I wanted to mention that like I've tracked attendance data for over 8 years now, and individuals with cerebral palsy, we've had 34 different individuals participate, which represents about 16% of our athlete population. Yet they represent over 49% of the participation. So 3 times of what you would expect. So what I'm trying to say is if you create the right environment, there is actually a demand for this type of programming because we really don't get it elsewhere, right? So that's very important. And we also are in the middle of conducting 2 qualitative studies around perceived levels of physical ability, not specific to cerebral palsy, just anybody in our program, but like I said, that includes people with cerebral palsy. And some of the pilot data qualitatively is also suggests that this type of approach is beneficial to individuals with cerebral palsy. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but